After a slow start to the day, which included pancakes and messing around with Mufasa, my sister took me to the Sweetwater Wetlands Nature Preserve. I was pretty excited to go looking for alligators, and I wasn't disappointed. We saw all sorts of different birds, and, of course, the alligators. Later that afternoon, I swapped out my old tires and chain, and my sister even helped me by vacuuming out the inside of my tent. That done, we made dinner before I spent the rest of the evening relaxing and planning out the next leg of my trip. I even got a little help as I worked on the previous week's video. I very reluctantly got back on the road the following morning. It was a great visit in Gainesville, and after spending 2 days with family, it was difficult to get myself out the door. Once out, I was able to use the bike lanes out of the city and made steady progress west on Route 26. Not too long after, I was able to get onto a section of the Nature Coast State Trail. During my stop for lunch, I discovered that there was a natural springs that was only 10 miles down the road along the way. Not really feeling like being on the road that day, I quickly decided to make a short day of it and set out for the springs. I met a fellow cyclist who joined me to the springs. It was a lot of fun to have someone to bike with, and he even did me a huge favor and helped me out when my old tube got a flat. We made it to Fanning Springs State Park, and I got signed in before heading down the road for a quick dinner before returning to check out the springs. I was impressed by how clear the water was. At a year-round 72 degrees, it was an amazing way to top off the day. Making the stop was definitely the right thing to do. The next morning, I set out to an early start on the remaining 14 miles of the bike trail before getting onto Route 98. With wide shoulders and surprisingly unbusy, it was actually a somewhat pleasant ride. I made great time and found a McDonald's with Wi-Fi where I was able to plan out the next few days. Once satisfied, I got a few supplies before biking a couple miles to my spot for the night. I got another early start on Thursday in anticipation of a long ride down to the coast. Back on 98, the day started out cloudy, a factor that I thoroughly enjoyed. The wide shoulders continued, and I made great time cruising down the flat road. I came to a paved bike path that I hadn't been expecting. It took me a dozen miles to a tiny roadside seafood shack where I stopped for a brief lunch. Shortly afterwards, I took Route 319, which took me a bit inland before reuniting with 98 back on the coast. Much to my disappointment, that's also where my generous shoulder ended. Thankfully, it wasn't too long before I got to my destination of Carrabelle. After getting dinner, I went to the fields where I was spending the night and discovered that there was a baseball game underway. With nowhere else to hang out, I set up in an unused dugout and waited out the game before setting up for the night. There was even a spigot that I was able to use for a much-needed wash. With another 90 miles ahead of me, I hit the road early the next morning. I was on Route 98 for the long haul, and thankfully the wide shoulder came back after leaving town. My coastal route offered me an occasional view of the Gulf of Mexico, as well as a lazy crosswind that was just strong enough to be an annoyance. I was able to make decent time when the road curved inland, and the miles steadily disappeared. Despite the wind, I got to my destination of Panama City, where I met my host. He treated me to a great dinner out in town before returning home and turning in for the night. The next morning, my host and I biked a couple miles down the road to a farmer's market for breakfast. A local couple who were eating at the crepe stand we went to were amazingly kind and bought me the St. Andrew's crepe, which I devoured. After purchasing some banana bread for the road, I said my goodbyes and headed out. In an effort to get off the highway, I turned onto Route 30, which turned out to be a mistake. Because of the Ironman race that I kicked off earlier that morning, the vast majority of the road was blocked off or otherwise impassable. So, after some maneuvering, I found my way back onto the highway. Not too long after, I got off on 30A, which, while offering me a decent bike path, slowed me down considerably, mostly because it kept switching sides of the road. After a short stretch back on 98, I got onto Old Highway 98, which proved a much smoother ride. I ended my day in Destin. My host for the evening made us a pasta dinner, which we shared over a fun conversation of past and future travels. I woke up on Sunday to the sounds of thunder, and appreciated the fact that I had slept indoors that night. My host was super kind, and allowed me to wait out the storm before heading out. With the worst of it past, I didn't get out on the road until 11:30. I was on 98 to Pensacola, and because of the crosswinds, I quickly decided to stay on the highway versus using the optional 399 to get a more scenic view out on the ocean. The first 22 miles were a struggle against the wind, but by mid-afternoon it calmed down significantly. I did end up pulling over to get out of some rain, but I was back on the bike after a few minutes and made great time on the highway. I crossed the long Pensacola Bay Bridge and found my way into the city. I rode the remaining 6 miles to my Airbnb, very excited to be taking tomorrow off and, hopefully, spending my last night in Florida before moving on to Alabama.